First, I should just confess that I got to hear this talk once before, last fall, when Carol gave it as part of the Maine Heritage Lecture. And it was down in the Buchanan Alumni House, and there was a wonderful audience. But I looked around and I realized a lot of the colleagues I wish could have made it weren't able to make it that day, and so I begged or twisted Carol's arm and asked her to do it here for us. One of the things, if you saw the little quote she had on the flyer, she quoted this amazing geographer, Fu Tuan. In times of climate change and threats to our environment, the more we know about place, the more we may empathize with the place and attempt to protect it. To me, that's one of the bridges between some of what we've been doing as part of the sustainability solutions work and what really comes forward from the humanities. And one thing that's interesting about this scholar, a really amazing geographer, he won basically the award that the American Geographical Society gives out for basically lifetime achievement. It's called the Stanley Brunn Award. And it's interesting to note that a good friend of ours also won that award, Bob Cates, who was the chair of our advisory board for 5 years and continues to be a big supporter of our work. And frankly, most of the good ideas we got from Bob. So you can even see geographers, I think, span that the worlds of the work we do. And I think Carol brings to us a really important perspective about how we root our work in place and then how we build on that to solve real-world problems. So just a little bit more about Carol. She's the director of the Maine Studies Program, a research associate in history here. This is where she earned her Ph.D. in history. She's really done a lot of different kinds of work. The first time I met her, I actually tried to figure out how I could drop into all of her classes, and then I turned out as way too busy to do that. So I continued to learn from her, just not as often as I would like. Welcome, Carol.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction, and thanks to the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm not used to speaking to scientists, so I do hope that people can make some connections between my comments and your work. So I hope that the thoughts that you're about to hear on a sense of place in Maine, even though they're drawn from the humanities, are useful in thinking about the interdisciplinary work on sustainability that engages many of us with Maine communities. So how is the concept of place important in this work? The cultural geographer Fu Tuan has said, the quote that David just mentioned, in times of climate change and threats to our environment, the more we know about place, the more we may empathize with the place and attempt to protect it, unquote. I chose to write this essay about place because in recent years, reference to place seemed ubiquitous in book titles. Let's see, I think I just go, yeah. Conference themes, proposals, academic articles, and even in advertising. But what do we mean by place? At first it seemed so simple. Place is a space with special meaning, and a sense of place is any attempt to express one's feelings about a place, for example, through writing, poetry, photography, or art. But in reality, I find that writing about place, to quote Theodore Roosevelt, is like nailing jelly to the wall. Just when you think you've nailed it, it slides away. The geographer Dolores Hayden uses another image. She says, quote, place is one of the trickiest words in the English language. A suitcase so overfilled one can never shut the lid. So today I want to unpack that suitcase and sort through its contents to examine the uses and limitations of this concept and how it might enhance our understanding of Maine. To shape this consideration of place, I'm drawing on my own 42 years of living and studying and teaching in Maine, beginning with a story of my first Maine experience, a story which began at a place just across the river from here. If you drive by the place today, it appears to be simply an apartment building at the edge of a research park on Bennick Road, across from the cemetery. But from 1970 to 1985, this was a school called Skittacuck. When I came to Maine in 1972 to teach at this school, I had never been to Maine before, so Skittacuck was my first introduction to the state, and it made a very strong impression on me. Built in 1834, the school building is sturdy red brick with a gray shingled addition on the back. For generations, this place was a farm, at one time the Sutton Dairy Farm. And for centuries before that, the nearby Penobscots likely fished in the river and hunted in the surrounding woods and fields. The very name of the school, Skittikuck, echoes the Wabanaki tradition of place names. In the Penobscot language, Skittikuck means still water, which is the nearby slow-moving river. The landscape was ideally suited for a school, surrounded as it was with a large yard and 60 acres of hay fields and woods and a sand pit. An old garage served as a barn that housed horses, goats, rabbits, and assorted birds. A pile of discarded boards became a homemade jungle gym and a treehouse with a long view. Students ages 4 years old through high school and teachers spent a lot of time outdoors, playing games, walking through the woods, riding horses in the fields, and in winter cross-country skiing and ice skating on the flooded front yard. This was the 1970s, a progressive time when alternative schools opened up across the state and also in other states as well, challenging the established educational system and supporting the idea that students should have more say in their own education. The school was part of the zeitgeist of the 1970s in Maine and across the country, when so many alternative organizations emerged to challenge the status quo. Organizations like Pine Tree Legal to provide legal aid for poor people, the Bangor Tenants Union to advocate for tenants' rights, Spruce Run, one of the oldest domestic violence projects in the country, and the Sam Ely Land Trust, a surprisingly radical organization that challenged private land ownership and named their organization after the Revolutionary War-era radical who came to Maine and asserted the common good over the power of privileged elites. It was during the 1970s that Maine's population increased by more than 132,000 people, and many of those people were back to the landers, attracted to Maine by Scott and Helen Nearing's vision of the good life, by the availability of cheap land, and also, according to some accounts, drawn by what they hoped would be a more meaningful connection to place. We came as part of this movement of young people to Maine, not to farm, but to teach. Our students included native Mainers, such as the high school student from Swans Island who boarded in Orono during the week and returned to Swans Island on the weekend, often bringing back dried, salted cod for her school snack. Or the teenage Penobscot student who wrote moving essays about his attachment to the land and the Penobscot River, and who took us in his boat to Orson Island to show us his hunting camp upriver from Indian Island. These and other Skittikuck students served as my main mentors, teaching me about their culture and their communities. Our students also included the children of Back to the Landers with names like Sky, Wind, and Kid. Some of them lived in hand-hewn log cabins off the grid, while one family wanted to build and live in a yurt in the school's backyard. We also enrolled children of University of Maine faculty and staff with their own progressive ideas that led them to consider alternatives to the public school system. So Skittikuck was linked both to traditional Maine and also to this network of progressive people and the organizations they wanted to change society. An experimental school made up of native Mainers and newcomers all joined together in a stunning landscape. It was an idyllic time in my life. This story gives us access to thinking about place by pulling some threads from the narrative and connecting them with ideas about place. As American Studies scholar Kent Ryden has observed, quote, "The nature and quality of a place can sink deep into you, influencing and conditioning the way you think, see, and feel, working far down into your very bones by simple virtue of residence and time," unquote. My experience living and teaching at Skittikuck certainly did sink deep and influences to this day how I think about Maine as a place of beautiful landscapes and people, both rooted and progressive. Perhaps the most obvious thread in this story is a love of place, or what the geographer Fu Tuan calls topophilia, which he defines as the affective bond between people and place. Art critic Lucy Lepard has written a fascinating book titled The Lure of the Local, Senses of Place in a Multi-Centered Society, in which she claims, quote, "Places have influenced my life as much as, perhaps more than, people," unquote. Lepard understands the essential local nature of place, where people and landscapes interact, It is the local that lures her. She writes, quote, "The intersection of nature, culture, and history form the ground on which we stand, our land, our place, the local," unquote. But not all people value such an attachment to place. Some people prefer movement rather than attachment. For others, memories of place can be painful, having to do with trauma or loss. Some people experience relocation to a place where they feel no attachment. Perhaps some sort of development has changed a beloved place beyond recognition, or perhaps for whatever reasons, people are experiencing placelessness. Others despair that globalization has obliterated distinct places, making all places more similar. Despite these examples of dislocation or place alienation, most of us can identify with and appreciate this simple notion of an affective connection to place. In fact, a psychologist friend of mine argues that we gain our sense of self in context, that self in context, and place is part of that context, is essential to self-understanding and well-being. Despite such psychological need for attachment to place, however, some critics argue that topophilia leads to overly sentimental nostalgia, and that the problem with place is that it is a backward-looking, static, and exclusive concept, and that people who love a place often resist change of any sort, preferring to keep the place exactly the same. Historian Karen Haltunen points out that in this view, the concept rests on a deeply conservative, essentialist understanding of place. Resistance to change may emerge if new ideas about a place are introduced, as, for example, when the town of Orono decided to develop the beautiful hayfields surrounding Skittacook into the current research park. While some saw the opportunity to develop the hayfields in order to increase the tax base for Orono, others felt the loss of these hayfields that were so much a part of the aesthetic and historic sense of place there. This example leads to a second thread that we can pull from the story, that place is contested. Geographer Doreen Massey, who has written about place for several decades, argues that champions of place cannot let the idea become static. In her article, A Global Sense of Place, she argues that place should be understood as fluid, contested, and changing. In fact, given that we all have our own ideas about place, there exist many senses of place. At the same time, she says that this fluidity of place does not mean that all changes are equal, or even that all changes are welcome. Sometimes it's better to save hayfields from further development. But she urges us to think of place as global, by which she means open to outside influences rather than closed to new people and new ideas. Massey further states that if we wish to connect to a place, we need to listen to the many stories of that place, so that we begin to see the complexities in placemaking. And this is the final thread that I wish to pull from the Skittacook story, the notion that places hold many stories from the past. In his essay, Why the Past Matters, environmental historian William Cronin writes that to better understand a place, we need to know its history. He asks, so how do we reconnect with the past? And he says, the answer, he says, is that we tell stories about it. Our connection to a place grows through understanding the stories and the historical context of that place. Skittacook did not just happen as a unique and isolated experiment, rather it was part of the 1970s counterculture that touched all of Maine and all of the country. William Cronin reminds us that the significance of stories from the past is not for the sake of any one story itself, but for what that story represents and how it signifies larger themes, how it reflects the larger historical context. The Skittacook story tells us something about one alternative school, but it also tells us about another era. My own study of Maine history has indeed led me to a deeper understanding of this region. I left Skittacook in the 1980s to study history here at the University of Maine. At that time, I was not focused on the meaning of place per se, but I see now how important place is in a regional approach to history. Those of us interested in social history have focused on the ways in which race, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and other identities have shaped ordinary people's lives. In the introduction to her book Of Place and Gender, the late UMaine historian Marley Weiner argued that, quote, place is the newest addition to the list of factors shaping our identity, unquote. As a graduate student, my research focused on Maine social history, particularly the skilled workers of the artisans of 19th century Bangor. Some academics interested in place look at the workers as a reflection of place. In Maine, for example, those who work the forests and farms and fisheries know the landscape and the seascape in specific ways related to their work. But other workers too contribute to the stories of place. Maine artisans were in transition during the years of early industrialization as the small shops of the traditional artisan system gave way to more mechanized production. These artisan parade banners from the 1840s illustrate the pride the artisans felt in their ability to advance civilization through their skills as housewrights and shipwrights, tinsmiths and blacksmiths, carriage makers and cabinet makers, coopers and cordwainers. The Bangor artisans left us with the records of their association meetings, where they reveal their pride in their work and their unique contributions to society. In an 1846 address titled "The Uncertainties of History," delivered to the Bangor Mechanic Association, the speaker lamented the historical focus on the fortunes of kings, captains, and conquerors, to the exclusion of the conditions of the great masses of mankind. He said, quote, "We are familiar with the names of those whose ambition has caused rivers of blood to flow, and who sought immortality of fame by the destruction of their species, but we are ignorant of those who first taught the arts of agriculture and other employments, whereby the physical as well as the moral condition of men has been improved." In addition to the artisans' skills and values, their work also reflected place, in that they made the edge tools, the saws, and axes for the workers in the nearby lumber woods, the caulked boots for the river drivers, and the plows and harnesses and shovels for the local farmers. Similarly, the textile mill workers in the late 19th century were embedded in place, dependent, as the mills were, on falling river waters to power the machines. My research on female mill workers and other Maine women workers drew largely from their writings, preserved in the Bureau of Industrial and Labor Statistics, where working women in 1888 were invited to write about their working and living conditions. Their comments offer a window into the working women's perspective. For example, this quote is from a female worker commenting on workplace gender inequality. "There is no doubt that the conditions of the working women can and should be improved. Why should men receive from $2 to $3 a day, and women doing the same quantity and in many cases a better quality of work receive but half the wages? Seems to me that if I work 9 hours a day and a man does the same work in the same number of hours, that we both should receive equal pay." Unquote. Some friends and I used this research to create a reader's theater piece, which we performed many times around the state, taking these working women's stories to conferences, historical societies, libraries, and other places such as the Farnsworth Museum in conjunction with their exhibit on the art of labor. Filmmaker Jim Sharkey also used this research for his film Hard Work, which we showed in many venues around the state. As William Cronin so persuasively argues, it isn't enough for historians to do this research. If we want people to know regional history and to know about place, then we must also relate these stories to the public, so that, in Cronin's words, we kindle an interest in others about place. By retrieving and telling these stories of Maine workers, we also demonstrate what the anthropologist Margaret Rudman refers to as multivocality and multilocality. Place is constructed in that people add meaning to places through working, building, landscaping, painting, writing, playing, and other activities. To understand place fully, we need to consider the varying experiences of many people who contributed to the making of that place. For example, the textile mill workers represented the working class, and additionally, because more than 3,000 of the 5,000 cotton mill workers in Lewiston in 1888 were French-Canadian women. They contributed their French-Canadian culture to the mix that is Maine's multicultural identity. Through this research and the Reader's Theater and the film, we point to the experience of women workers in Maine and also to the important place of French-Canadian immigration to Maine. So we've seen that place is local and global, fluid and contested and constructed, and it is characterized by multilocality and multivocality. Further, we have determined that place-based stories enrich our understanding of place. How might we integrate these ideas about place with other disciplinary approaches studying place in Maine? My own academic background steered me initially to the study of history, but moving to the interdisciplinary Maine Studies Program opened the possibility of insights through other disciplines. While geographers, landscape historians, literary theorists, art historians, anthropologists, folklorists, sociologists, and other academics use place as a lens in their various disciplines, I want to use a few examples from just two areas, folklore and literature. In his book titled Mapping the Invisible Landscape, Kent Ryden, formerly of USM, demonstrated that the invisible landscape refers to those things not readily seen in the landscape, characteristics that folklorists and writers can reveal about a landscape. While the casual visitor would not understand or notice certain things about a landscape, skillful folklorists and writers are able to get at what has happened in a place. Some refer to the, quote, local knowledge as that specialized knowledge of an area that communities know about a place. Folklorists investigate local knowledge as a reflection of place. In her study of Maine writer and educator Fanny Hardy Ekstrom, Paulina McDougall points to Ekstrom's local knowledge, her understanding of the area's natural history, ethnography, and history as evidence of Ekstrom's, quote, concern for place, unquote. UMaine's iconic folklorist Sandy Ives spent decades studying the work and songs of woodsworkers in Maine and the Canadian Maritimes, research that has enriched our understanding of the invisible landscape. The songs Professor Ives collected tell us about the loggers and their bosses, their work, and their camp life. This cartoon suggests, with no small dose of irony, that authenticity is an important characteristic of place, raising questions of invented traditions and Disneyfication, meaning the lack of authenticity. While questions of authenticity bear some consideration, Ives cautioned against the kind of folklore that attempts to strictly codify and authenticate folk material. He offered the Francis James Child collection of English and Scottish ballads as an example of the limitations of this approach. Ives explained that Child included 305 ballads in his collection and, quote, he thought he had pretty much covered the whole show, unquote. But then people began finding other ballads not included in the collection, blurring the line between authentic and other. Ives came down on the side of change, saying that folk songs and folk traditions generally are not static, but they change. He sees the logging songs as part of an ongoing tradition, a continuity of creativity. Recently, I attended an event to honor Sandy and Bobby Ives, where two undergraduate students, Hillary Warner Evans and Taylor Cunningham, talked about recent ballads that tell the story of the North Pond Hermit in Maine, further evidence of the continuity of creativity rather than a static understanding of folk songs. Anthropologist Harold Prince has examined another folk tradition, Wabanaki ash basket making, and I know this group knows something about that situation, a tradition tied closely to the landscape that provides the brown ash trees from which the baskets are made. Prince wrote an essay on Wabanaki traditions in which he discussed the difficulty of maintaining traditional culture in the face of colonialism and how tourism in particular puts pressure on traditional cultures. Prince argued that Wabanaki splint ash baskets, for example, were not in fact an old tradition, but were a response to 19th century tourist interests in baskets. He saw no evidence for ash basket making prior to the 19th century in the historical or archaeological records, and he concluded that splint ash baskets are in fact an invented tradition, one that emerged in response to tourist demands, rather than the centuries-old tradition that Wabanakis believed it was. When a Passamaquoddy graduate student of mine, who happens to be a master basket maker as well, read this article by Prince, he strongly objected to Prince's interpretation. He argued that basket making was so common in Wabanaki culture that it would not necessarily have been mentioned in the records. but that the many oral stories about basket making, handed down through the generations, convinced him that the tradition does in fact predate the 19th century. So here we are, again reminded that place-based folk traditions are contested, as an academic challenged the origins of the tradition, while a Passamaquoddy basket maker defended the ancient roots of that tradition. Like folklore, literature also reveals the invisible landscape. Consider two essayists, James Francis and Wendy Griswold, whose essays offer contrasting views of place. James Francis, the Penobscot Nation historian, has written a brief introduction to Above the Gravel Bar, a book on Wabanaki canoe routes in Maine, in which he recounts the feelings he had when he left Maine during his military service in Wyoming. He wrote, quote, "I got a profound feeling of displacement. The homesickness wasn't limited to my family, friends, and tribal members. I missed the landscape. Wyoming, seemingly devoid of trees and rivers, was a foreign landscape to me. To truly understand Penobscot history, you must understand the ancestral landscape," unquote. In contrast to Francis's situating place in the landscape, sociologist Wendy Griswold, in her article, History plus Resources equals a Sense of Place, explored Maine literature in search of place. She argued that the state had a strong sense of place that derives from its impressive literary history. Again, two people bring their different backgrounds to the question of place, resulting in two different ways to express place. Francis finding the meaning of place in the natural landscape, and Griswold finding it in the literary landscape. Other writers also find that fiction offers valuable sources through which to explore place. In fact, the Southern novelist Eudora Welty has argued, quote, "Fiction depends for its very life on place," unquote. Consider Christopher Fahey's short story, The Glow of Copper, which examines the intersections of place and class, insider and outsider. Poverty drove the main character, Hattie, to sell her main home to out-of-staters, Fred and Khaki. Sometime later, the new owners invited Hattie in to show her all the wonderful changes they had made. Hattie was surprised and hurt that Fred and Khaki had paved over the garden to put in a driveway, replaced the blueberry fields with a lawn, and made many other changes that Hattie saw as a loss to her sense of place. As Khaki walked Hattie through the remodeled house, Fahey wrote of Hattie, quote, "Her head was swimming. She could hardly remember the way things used to be. Oscar had died here, right where the summer people's piano was standing now. The bedroom was freezing cold, so they had moved Oscar to the kitchen, right next to the stove, but he died all the same. With the wall opened up, the view is superb," Khaki said. "So peaceful." "Yeah," Hattie said, and her voice sounded distant and thin. She looked through the sliding glass doors, and a shock went through her. "My apple trees," she said. Khaki tilted her head. "It was dreadful to have to cut them down, but they were right in the line of our view. Unfortunate." Hattie thought, those trees had been Gravensteins, wonderful keepers, apples you couldn't buy in any store. For years they had been the only fruit they ate all winter, and now they were gone, cut down for a view, unquote. We can readily find other examples of novelists describing contested visions of place. Catherine Baker's Island Girl is a short story in which mother and daughter, deeply rooted Mainers, are walking the beach near their home when a new resident comes running out of his house shouting, "You people are on private property. Are you aware of that? This isn't a public right-of-way. This land is posted and it belongs to the association," unquote. Aggravated and frustrated, the mother shouts back, quote, "My people dug clams here and had clam feeds and beached their boats and spread their nets and made their weirs and walked on this beach before your kind ever heard of this island. This land don't belong to you or anybody else but the tide," unquote. The implied question over place resonates today. Who has the right of access to Maine's beaches? Jack Ailey's short story, Letter from Maine, How I Learned to Love Junk Cars, presents a more likable newcomer who buys a piece of land from his neighbor, Charlie. Upon purchasing the land, the buyer insists that Charlie clear the dozens of junk cars currently littering the landscape. While the cars are never all cleared away, the newcomer finally learns to live with the junk cars as he comes to realize that Charlie is actually a good man whose many kind and helpful traits trump his vastly different cultural aesthetic that favors a landscape littered with junk cars that just might be useful someday for their spare parts. One of my favorite Maine novelists, the skillful writer Ruth Moore, has written many novels, including Spoonhandle, in which the heroes work as fishermen, while the villains are A, out-of-staters who try to buy Maine lands cheaply, and B, locals who sell their way of life for immediate gratification. In her article, Homesick for That Place, one-time UMaine English professor Jennifer Pixley wrote of Moore's deep roots in the landscape and culture of Maine's working coast where she grew up. Though Moore was writing in the mid-20th century, she tapped into themes relevant to current concerns over Maine's quality of place, such as coastal development, the residential squeeze put on the working waterfront, poverty, and substance abuse, to name just a few of the issues she addressed. There are many examples to demonstrate the ways in which place in Maine is fluid, contesting, and constructed. But in her address to an American Studies Association conference, historian Karen Haltunen added another dimension to consider in our discussion of place. Just as UMaine anthropologist Jim Atchison worked with Maine lobstering communities to better understand the unique culture of lobster fishing, Haltunen pointed out that, quote, knowledge itself is implaced, inescapably situated. We live in place, make our homes and raise our families in place, vote in place, and teach and write and eventually die in place. And growing numbers of us are beginning to practice our craft beyond the boundaries of our campuses, engaging with larger publics in partnership with other cultural workers from the communities in which we live. She's advocating here for the practice of engaged scholarship, in which academics partner with local communities in what she called an active engagement in making and remaking place. My own experience with this type of community-engaged research was through the Somali Narrative Project with my friends and colleagues Kim Heisman, Maisie Huff, and Kristen Langelier. This interdisciplinary and engaged scholarship involved a collaboration with University of Maine Somali students and the Somali community in Lewiston to collect a library of stories, as one Somali woman described the project, so that Maine people would better understand who the Somalis are and why they are here, so that Maine policymakers might make better policy decisions regarding this community, and so that Somalis themselves would have these oral histories, these records of their immigrant experiences, some spoken in English and others in Somali, for future generations of Somalis. The stories include memories of war and refugee camps, and also life in Somalia before the war. One interviewee recalled the sights and tastes of pre-Civil War Mogadishu this way. Quote, we had Chinese and Italian restaurants. My very favorite place was this Italian place where we used to eat Italian pastries. I still remember even the case where those items were. The guy who owned the place was Italian, and he used this beautiful custard in those shells. I can still taste how sweet it was, just walking through those beautiful avenues and streets, getting those desserts, going to the movies, and going back home at night happy. It was just a wonderful time, unquote. This interviewee brings his memory of Somalia to Maine. His past in Somalia becomes part of the Maine cultural context, so that now this region includes parts of Somali culture, challenging the overwhelmingly negative images of Somalia, while also demonstrating how multi-locality characterizes and constructs place. As Somalis negotiate schools, jobs, and housing in Maine, they face many of the same cultural barriers that challenged the French-Canadian mill workers who had been the newcomers in Lewiston a century earlier. As Doreen Massey has remarked, the forces of globalization can make us defensive and reactionary about our sense of place, hostile toward newcomers, or those forces can prompt us to respond in a progressive, more global sense of place. She argued that placemaking involves both roots, R-O-O-T-S, and roots, R-O-U-T-S, saying that the new intrusions are no more from outside, no more out of place than were in their time many of the components of the currently accepted character of the place. In graduate seminars that I teach, Maine Studies graduate students have taken some of the ideas about place presented here and responded with their own very creative research projects. Erin Kate Souza is a Maine Studies graduate student who works with international students through the intensive English Institute here on campus. Linda Silka of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center, formerly and currently, as you probably know, with the Mitchell Center, visited one of our graduate seminars to discuss community engagement. And Erin Kate responded to Linda's passion for engaged scholarship and her call for more academics to become involved with local communities. Erin Kate recognized how engaged scholarship could provide international students the opportunity to learn about place firsthand. She put together an English as a second language course that included an engaged scholarship or service learning component, allowing students to take part in local school and after-school programs. Erin Kate taught this course last semester and found that her international students gained a better understanding of Maine people and places while also improving their English language skills. Another student, Amy Hinckley, picked up on Kent Ryden's idea when he visited our class and talked about how we can actually read a landscape. That is, to carefully examine a landscape in order to learn what it tells us about the past, just as we understand and interpret historical documents. As an architect, Amy chose to read the built landscape in Waldoboro, Maine, by walking the land looking for clues in stone walls, cellar holes, and extant buildings, and also by examining tax maps, property deeds, building permits, and other historical documents. She found that the built landscape can be understood as a cultural artifact, and the settlement patterns of the rural built landscape construct a distinct sense of place in Maine. Like Ryden, she found that the invisible landscapes are historical as long as we learn how to read them. Her study of Waldoboro presented evidence that reflects the agricultural history in other parts of Maine, from subsistence farms to occupational diversity, and finally to the decline of agriculture as the soil became too depleted to keep young people on the farm, especially when other economic and agricultural opportunities offered greater prosperity. She found that Mainers abandoned their farms in the late 19th century. Barns and other buildings resulted in rotting into the ground, and trees reforested the fields. She wrote, "Nature and culture both had a part in the making of place." Graduate student Renee Kelly, who is the director of the Innovation Center here on campus, focused her research on innovation. She wrote a paper titled Place-Based Innovation, Maine Patents in the 19th Century, which includes patent applications related to logging, lumbering, papermaking, farming, shipbuilding, and fishing. She found patents for water-powered custom saws to cut veneers and blind slats and shingles and toothpicks. She discovered an 1855 patent to make tree bark into paper, and then 70 more patents between 1855 and 1889 for making paper. Additionally, she found more than 100 textile-related patents between 1836 and 1889. Renee created maps to demonstrate how patents reflect the use of the landscape. For example, this map tracks forest-related patents between 1836 and 1870 and indicates that 28 patents were submitted in the Bangor area, Maine's most important lumber towns in that era. She argued that innovation is linked with the landscape and the knowledge its residents developed as a result of their interaction with the geography. Graduate student Stephanie Leonard, an art teacher in Bangor, drew ideas from Lucy Lepard and others to examine how Maine's public art both constructs and reflects a sense of place. She considered a wide range of public art in Maine, including this sculpture by Penobscot artist Tim Shea, placed on a medicine trail on Indian Island. Her research included the Schoodic Sculpture Symposium that draws both local and international artists to create sculptures from Maine granite. Artist Don Meserve sculpted this piece titled Cleat from Jonesboro granite and placed it in Winter Harbor. Visible during high and low tide, the sculpture is an obvious reference to the surrounding place. Stephanie also integrated the Maine labor mural into her thesis as an example of public art that reflects the region and that has become quite controversial. This is a section of the mural that Judy Taylor painted for the Maine Department of Labor and that Governor LePage had removed due to what he saw as a one-sided treatment of labor history. It is currently housed in the Maine State Museum. Leonard argued that this mural offers a wonderful opportunity to teach art, history, and current political controversy, and called for public school teachers to make better use of Maine's public art to engage school children with their surroundings. Graduate student George Neptune is a Passamaquoddy tribal member who researched Passamaquoddy place names on Mount Desert Island. Drawing on the work of Wabanaki language specialists, he explained the naming of several sites on MDI, names that I won't attempt to pronounce, but which reflect characteristics of places, such as the clam digging place, the cold spring place, or the place that blows water. George also referred to Wabanaki Gluskap myths and how they explain certain geologic features in the landscape, bringing to mind Kent Ryden's comment that European expansion into the continent, quote, was accomplished at the continual expense of Native Americans whose mythic interpretation of the landscape was pushed aside and imaginatively paved over by whites who assumed that they were moving into blank geographical space and believed that since they themselves could place no narratives on the territory they were settling, no such narratives existed. Finally, graduate student Wynne Guglielmo, influenced by the research methods of folklorist Sandy Ives and anthropologist Jim Atchison, based her research on the work of a Down East worm digger. Through interviews and photographs, as well as state government reports and secondary sources on Maine's multi-million-dollar bloodworm industry, she found that the worm digger she interviewed was thoroughly knowledgeable about this resource and this landscape. And like Atchison's lobster gangs, worm diggers keep good sites a secret. The worm digger told Wynne, quote, "The more you talk, the more competition. It's like mining for gold. You got to keep that secret. If you don't keep that claim secret, and it takes only one person before it's all over, someone else is going to know," unquote. Also similar to Atchison's lobster gangs, this worm digger expressed tremendous concern over protecting the resource and recommended that the state scientists make greater efforts to consult the worm diggers themselves when addressing the problems that result from overharvesting the worms. So why does place matter? First, place matters because it can give us a new angle on the world, just as gender or class or any other analytic lens helps us see things in a new way. Similarly, place may also provide us with a new vision and result in new insights. As Fu Tuan said, quote, "While we often take place for granted, when we do think about it, it may assume unexpected meanings and raise questions we have not thought to ask," unquote. The geographer Tim Cresswell answers the question this way: place is how we make the world meaningful and the way we experience the world. And second, our connection to place may result in a greater sense of responsibility for our place. Tuan has said, quote, "In times of climate change and threats to our environment, the more we know about place, the more we may empathize with the place and attempt to protect it," unquote. Just as the worm digger's work on the mudflats resulted in his deep knowledge about and concern for the resource, likewise Maine's 19th century farmers were also good stewards of the land and early advocates for conservation as a result of their knowledge gained through working the land and their attachment to place. UMaine historian Dick Judd concludes his history on the origins of conservation in northern New England this way: "Searching out the seeds sown in these local cultures of resource use reveals the spiritual source of the American commons, the love of place, the faith in common stewardship, the commitment to democratic access, and the reverential respect for a fragile equilibrium between culture and nature. This is the legacy that made the American people so receptive to conservation at the turn of the century, and the source of their abiding concern for protecting and sustaining the natural world today," unquote. It seems appropriate to end this consideration of place with some thoughts from the Penobscot people. Last summer, plans emerged for a new landfill in either Argyle or Greenbush in a location potentially close to Penobscot Indian land and water. In response to those landfill proposals, the Penobscot Nation issued a resolution stating their opposition to the proposal and outlining the threat to their environment, their people, and their culture. In July, the Penobscots led a protest march through Old Town and turned out in impressive numbers at a Department of Environmental Protection public meeting. At that meeting, about 60 people, many of them Penobscots, spoke out against the proposal, basing their opposition to the landfill on its threat to their environment and their way of life. In his public statement of opposition, Chief Kirk Francis referenced the 1980 Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, saying, quote, "That settlement was based on enhancement of cultural practices critical to the identity of our people, including the ability to hunt, fish, and practice our federally protected subsistence lifestyle. We have the right for our resources to be in a condition that is conducive to our lifestyle," end quote. Tribal member Maria Gerard of the Penobscot Nation Cultural and Historic Preservation Department also testified, saying that the plan jeopardized all creatures living in the area. She urged protection of the Penobscot River, calling it a sacred river. And finally, tribal historian James Francis spoke against the landfill proposal, stating the importance of the place, explaining the Penobscot Nation's cultural attachment to this place, and quoting Fu Tuan, who said, "Space plus culture equals place." Francis underscored the importance of place and asked, "What kind of place do we want to live in?" Happily, the state has ruled in favor of the Penobscot people and other locals opposed to the Argyle and Greenbush locations for the landfill, demonstrating the power of people moved by the question James Francis posed, what kind of place do we want to live in? Thank you.
Questions? So Carol, I'm going to ask a really weird question.
Okay.
It's sort of about the place as this intersection between continuity and change.
Mm-hmm.
But and I was at some of those public hearings about Greenbush and Argyle, and a lot of the remarks that the Penobscot made resonated with me. But when we think about many places in Maine, some of which made sense a long time ago, and it's harder for them to make sense in today's world, somebody would call those kind of reactions NIMBY, right? They'd say something like, "not in my backyard." And actually, out of that conversation and with work with the Penobscots, we've become involved in a kind of a statewide work in the Silk Consulting lead on solid waste issues. Mm-hmm. And so, to not have a landfill here might just mean it's got to be somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Or you've got to do something very different that we haven't figured out how to do yet, like reduce our consumption. How do you think about that, and what are the lessons learned that sort of provide opportunities for finding common ground?
Not so good on finding common ground, I suppose. I think that's a real specialized skill probably of mediators and so on, but I think it's a good question to say, what about NIMBY? How does that fit in? And, I think it just has to be case by case. I mean, those proposed landfills were also threatening the Penobscot River as well. And of course, as you know, how much money and effort has been put into cleaning up the river. So there are probably better places to put a landfill. But finding a place that somebody isn't going to squawk about is not easy. And I certainly don't know the answer to that one, but I think it's true of just about so many other issues we can think of, from windmills to underwater turbines and for tidal energy. So that's, of course, the key question is, how do you find the right place for these things? Or, the bigger question, how do we reduce our landfill needs? So it's a good question. It's a hard one. Paulina?
Well, along those same lines, it occurs to me that I think one of the things that your talk brings out, and I think it's important to think about, is that the democratic notion of place. And so if we have to make a decision about something like that, who makes the decision? Is the decision, are the people who live there allowed to have a say in what's going to happen to their landscape? Who's involved? So I think that's part of it. I think, when we're making a decision about a landfill.
Absolutely.
Is it the perfect place for it? Okay, well, who lives there? And maybe we should have a conversation with them about it.
Exactly. And I think in a democracy, it's a good idea for comments to come from the bottom up rather than from the top down, at least the way I understand democracy. So I think that's true, is involving as many people as possible in in directing public policy or inviting everybody from residents to scientists to maybe someday humanities people to inform the policy, to help inform policy making.
Along the same lines, one of the things that comes out in one of the classes I teach a lot is we do a lot of readings about how certain conservation decisions or practices impacted various people in a negative way because they were not consulted. And sometimes things have to be reversed afterwards because there was no democratic process involved. These are things that have happened in the past. So I think that kind of practice is essential for this.
Just so, and if my understanding of SSI is correct, then the job here is to communicate between what the scientists are learning about where the tidal water, underwater tidal machine should be placed by consulting the local people in the fishing industry, people in the fishing industry, people who own shops in Eastport. I'm not sure who all is included in that discussion, but I think that's what people are learning in SSI is to really make the discussion as wide as possible in terms of people who might be involved. Yeah.
And I think speaking to that point, it's a nice thought that permeates this talk, and in discussing sense of place is really senses of place.
Right.
And there's not one final sense of place. It's both evolutionary and it's also made up of many different parts.
Yes. It's contested and it's always changing. And again, I don't know how, if somebody pressed me on whether or not that industrial park should have been developed in that last hayfield, that beautiful hayfield. Again, the NIMBY argument, I hated to see it come in, and yet there were some very strong economic arguments. Of course, I must say most of it is empty now, so it's kind of a shame. But yeah, it's that same question of.
Well, I think there's a difference between the sense that we don't want anything to change and the sense that we don't want anything destroyed. I mean, I think most people, reasonable people, will agree that we do need to change.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we don't want to destroy anything.
But I think it's important to bring that idea of change in, because after I read that idea that, well, the sense of place is nice, but it can be very conservative and nostalgic and so on. But if we try to think like Doreen Massey encourages us to do about a global sense of place, and she doesn't mean by that every hayfield needs to consider global consequences, but I think of it more like with immigrants and the Somali community and so on, that if you're more open to these changes, the more beneficial they can be, I think. Yes, Linda?
A couple of your slides, they're all beautiful, but a couple of your slides had rivers, and I think rivers are really interesting in terms of sense of place because they have been places that so many different people have inhabited and used at so many different times, and we do so many different things with it. So in terms of your, the contested sense of place, but also really important things, and just a really rich, kind of interesting place to think about sustainability issues.
Yeah. And so key to Maine's overall sense of place and the economy and the history and cultures. So
the metaphor even extends a little bit further because a river is pictured as a river, but a river is constantly changing
Exactly.
its course and its flow.
Boy, somebody could write just an awesome, I think, essay around that about the role of rivers in our sense of place generally, and using again many of these humanities examples, and it could be a beautiful.
People thought they could put anything in the river.
Yeah.
It wouldn't matter because it's going away.
Yeah.
So we don't need to think about what we're putting in it. And obviously that was not true.
Yeah.
We had years and years of destruction in, say, the Penobscot, where it became extremely polluted.
Yeah.
At one time it provided the drinking water for Bangor. And of course at some point they stopped that.
Yeah.
Because it was no longer drinking.
Yeah, even in the 19th century already, the Penobscot River was so incredibly polluted by the logging industry. It was just so full.
And the tanneries. And,
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes.
For a sense of place, what I always enjoyed most was this ability to bring together old and new. It's not just conservative, what everything staying as it is. It can brings this thing together to something in between that no one really intended beforehand.
Right.
I always think of, I mean, you mentioned the history of the 19th century, and I think of that changes to the sense of place that happened before. Now these shoe factories or the mills, they've become part of the landscape, and now all of a sudden the sense of place that there were mills. And back then, some people would probably be like, mills? That's a terrible idea.
Yeah. No, yeah, absolutely. And certainly about immigrants too. When I think of mills, I think of immigrants, but certainly people thought that immigrants were a bad idea too in the 19th century, particularly when the French Canadians came down to work in the mills. And now, same town, we took the Somali students, in fact, to Lewiston to do a little play. It was part in English and part in French, because a lot of Somalis speak French from the Djibouti area. And so they were able to actually talk to some of the older Francos in the crowd and talk about, we're the immigrants now. You did it 100 years ago, and now we're the immigrants. And so there was some common ground there in terms of, because in many cases, the Francos there were not welcoming to, everyone was not welcoming at times, although things have really gone much better in recent years, I think, in Lewiston. But, yeah, that changing notion again.
If I could just pick up on that for a second and make a plug for Mark Anderson's talk in 2 weeks. One of the things, when we sent out the flyer, there's a few sentences underneath it where you'll see a little bit more about it. One of the things they tried to do is, particularly about the Northwoods Park around the Millinocket area, was to, there's a lot of different views of that about continuity and change, and basically try to ask people how they viewed this, but ask it in a way that first allowed some of the people to think about what had already happened in the past, when, by the way, there were lots of people who thought the park that became Baxter State Park was a really bad idea. The state legislature didn't want it, and the locals didn't want it, and yet he went and did it himself, sort of. And when they thought about the past, I think he's going to show in his results of a big survey that they were more open to thinking about a future park by kind of linking that past and future view. So I think there's something very interesting here that is a thread across many of the conversations we keep having in this space.
Yes, exactly.
It's wonderful.
Yeah. And before that, in fact, people were opposed to creation of Acadia Park too. So now we think of it as like one of Maine's greatest assets, and yet people were very much opposed to that creation of that park.
I just have to do one story about that. So Senator Mitchell often gets asked, what, when you brokered the peace in Northern Ireland, how on earth did you do that? You must have learned a lot about conflict resolution and mediation while you were the Senate Majority Leader. And he quickly says, oh, no, I didn't learn it there. I learned it trying to create Acadia National Park. The landowners and the stakeholders were all so crazy that that's his story.
Yeah. Or Baxter probably. Was it Baxter Park?
No, he was talking about Acadia.
Yeah, which happened before his time, right?
No, there were still, yes, but there were still
I see.
holdings in the early 80s
I get
that he was, not the very beginning,
Yeah,
but it continued
I
for
see. Yeah,
even in his early
interesting.
Senate career. Well, thank you so much, Carol.
Well,
What a
thank you.
wonderful talk.
Thank you all.